Well, I'm excited to be talking about one of my favorite areas of subject when it comes to the background of the Bible, and that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to spend a little time talking about several aspects of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the story of their discovery, the history themselves, what are the scrolls, who produced the scrolls, and then ask some questions about the meaning of the scrolls. My guess is when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, most people have heard of them, perhaps even heard controversies or rumors about them, but very few people understand what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are, why they actually matter. And the scrolls are one of the areas where there's often, you'll hear sometimes on the History Channel or in novels, the secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the hidden messages of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so what I hope to show you is really why they're important, what they matter, where the questions are, and what in the end is a pretty remarkable story about their discovery. So I want to jump right into it. Before we can really understand the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we need to understand the sort of landscape of the Bible, our manuscripts, our understanding of the biblical accuracy prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Dead Sea Scrolls really gave us a window, a much older window into the texts, the manuscripts, particularly of the Old Testament, but also the first century world. So we need to understand that landscape. The scrolls are going to be discovered 1947, 1948, although it'll be some time until they're fully published. But basically, we're going to be looking at what was our understanding of the Old Testament, the manuscripts prior to that date of 1947. And there's a few really important elements here we want to take a look at when it comes to our understanding prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So first of all, these are the three oldest manuscripts that scholars had access to prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I want to give you a brief summary of each one. So the first of the manuscripts I want to talk about is what's known as the Aleppo Codex. It's originally identified with a group of Jewish scholars from Tiberias, that's along the Sea of Galilee, after the fall of Jerusalem. In 70 AD, it became a real rabbinic center, and so you have scribes and scholars working that produced this manuscript of the Old Testament. It was eventually moved to Syria, it's why it's known as the Aleppo Codex, to a synagogue there. And it was during the instability rioting during the 1940s that part of this manuscript actually went missing. So there's most of the Torah, the first 5 books, have been missing. But eventually it was smuggled back into Israel. And today, most of what remains of the Aleppo Codex is within the Shrine of the Book, we'll talk about a little bit later. But we know and have copies of this Aleppo Codex, and it's one of the oldest sources we have for the Old Testament manuscript. So around the year 1000. The second of those is the Leningrad Codex, again, from around this period of 1000. And we know roughly the dates on these because many of these medieval period manuscripts have an end plate or a final page where they give information about the scribes, the copyists, about the date in which they were produced, and perhaps some of the scribal techniques or the schools that they were from. So generally, the Leningrad Codex is identified with 1008 AD. So again, 1,000 years after this common era. And then the third of those of the oldest are what is known as the Cairo Codex. And scholars debate its precise date, particularly the date that's included in it in the manuscript. They believe, based on its pretty technical research, the kind of script that's being used and the particular methods the scribes are using, that it too is around the year 1000 AD. So the reason I want to show this to you is when it comes prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest manuscripts that were in existence of the Old Testament, so what we base our Hebrew Bibles off of, which produce our English translations, that common core Hebrew Bible, scholars were making that version from combining these manuscripts, comparing these manuscripts, the oldest of which we have are about 1000 AD. So about 1,000 years old. And obviously these Old Testament passages go back, as much as 1,000 more, at least 1,000, if not 2,000 years older than those that we have from the medieval period. So there's this big gap between what were the original Old Testament manuscripts and what scholars had at the time, which again are these manuscripts from around the year 1000. Those manuscripts are associated with a group of scribes known as the Masoretes. And the Masoretes have a particular influence on the manuscripts, and I've included in this image 3 different variations of what are the Hebrew scripts. So on the left, you see the first century text. You'll notice it actually looks a little bit cleaner. The kind of block scripts are pretty clean. And then the Masoretic texts, which are representative of those versions we were just discussing, you notice there's dashes and lines and dots. The old first century and older manuscripts of the Hebrew writings did not include vowels. They were just written with consonants. That may seem strange to us, but it abbreviated, obviously, and gave room for more words on manuscripts. And you might be surprised if somebody gave you a passage in English. Sometimes you'll see this online where they'll cover up half of the letters on the bottom, and you can still read the words just from the form of the tops of letters. Or I bet if I gave you a passage and took out all the vowels in English, you could probably, particularly if you were familiar with the passage I was quoting, even without the vowels, you could pretty quickly read. You'd be surprised how easily, because we know we're familiar with the information, and we know the words, the language well enough to be able to piece that together in our minds. So what was happening in the ancient world with Hebrew is the vowels were not included, and so you learned the meaning, because often you could have words that if the vowels were different, the meaning of the word could be different. So the way you understood the text, the way you learned the text, was you heard the reading of this scripture over and over, and you learned the tradition of its pronunciation, its inclusion of the vowels in the way that you read it or spoke it. Well, the Masoretes, around this period of 1000, were concerned that as Hebrew was coming less and less common, there was concern that the tradition of how the text should be read might be lost. And so they created this, what's called the vowel pointing system. So they didn't want to mess with the words themselves. They didn't want to insert letters into the sacred text. So as you see in this image, they created this way of notating the text, notating vowels by these lines, by these dots, and the series of them. If you take a biblical Hebrew class today, you learn this version. You learn to read with these vowel pointings. Although I've also included in here a little bit of modern Hebrew, which is significantly different than biblical Hebrew, but obviously is using the same script and has some connections like Old English would have with modern English. But today, most modern Hebrew does not involve vowels at all. They write in consonants like before. But these Masoretic scribes are the ones who are giving us these notated, kind of detailed, vowel worked out recordings of the biblical texts that have been handed down to them. And so when we find much older scripts, like they would find on tombs or perhaps on coins or other pieces of archaeology, we knew that those vowels didn't actually exist in those oldest forms. This will become important as we get into the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they'll represent this much older form of Hebrew before those vowels had actually been worked out. Now, to understand the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we need to understand a little bit about how these scrolls make their way down to us over history. I've got here sort of a really rough kind of diagram that would be far more complex. This is a simplification. But you have back in history the original copy. So in this case, let's say the original Isaiah scroll. There have been scribes since that original that have copied and passed down these variations of scrolls to the next scribe, to the next scribe, to the next scribe. And these scrolls also end up traveling to other parts of the world. As Jews would scatter, they would take with them their sacred texts. And so you have these traditions. You have these descendants of scrolls, these kind of that track their way back to the original, that might all be sort of centered around Egypt, or centered around Israel, or centered around the Jews that are living in places like Persia. And we don't have, I've kind of grayed these out, we don't have all of the descendants of these manuscripts from the original one. But as we get down here to the discovered manuscripts, the ones we have, let's say this Isaiah scroll from 200 BC, 100 BC, possibly 100 AD, the rough date whenever these scrolls are lost. We'll talk about that again too. But we have these kind of much later versions. So how can we know, or how can we track which of these versions are accurate, and how well do they represent the original versions? We're going to see in a moment, one of the questions people have about scrolls is, if you have generations of scribes who are copying them, how do we know that they're not editing them, they're inserting them, they're adding to them, reshaping them? How can we trust, if we don't have the oldest versions, how can we trust that what we have actually represents these oldest original scrolls themselves? This whole area of study is what is known as textual criticism. And so what scholars do, I've got kind of three laid out here, is let's say these represent the manuscripts that we have discovered, these ones from the year 1000 or around 1000. What scholars will do is they'll collect up all of the manuscripts they have. Then they begin comparing letter by letter, word by word, line by line. They're trying to look at where are there differences across all of these variations of the text, which, remember, if we come back to our kind of descendant tree here, technically, if all of these manuscripts are sort of from the region of Egypt or from the region of Persia, then we would expect them to sort of be cordoned off. You know, you don't have these scrolls being compared in the ancient world to other geographic places. They tend to be copied in these schools of scribes. So you're getting these traditions within these various schools, within these various geographical areas. And so scholars will compare them across all of that. And then they'll begin to evaluate the history where they find these changes. They can note, well, all of the manuscripts from this particular Egyptian school of scribes seem to have this variant spelling of certain words, but yet all of the other manuscripts use this different spelling. So by looking at all of the manuscripts they have access to and comparing every detail, they're able to actually track where some of these changes in spelling or words, where they were perhaps just errors that a scribe made, where they're perhaps associated with a certain school of scribes. And by comparing all of those, they're able to piece back together with a pretty high degree of accuracy what probably the original manuscripts would have actually looked like, because they have all of these various traditions to be able to compare. And this is an area called textual criticism. The second thing I want to talk about, so we've talked a little bit about where we were before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of our manuscripts of the Old Testament from around 1000 AD. The other thing that's important to talk about is our picture into the first century world, or the intertestamental period. I'll often refer to the first century world because particularly what I'm interested in, is this New Testament period, or the gospel period when Jesus is doing his ministry. We're trying to understand what Judaism looked like in the first century. Many of the actual scrolls in the library, the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls, are going to be older than that. They're going to be scrolls from this intertestamental period, maybe 250, 300 BC. But we're going to learn a lot about the community that had those scrolls. We'll see in a moment the Essenes and Qumran. And their writings are going to give us a picture into the world of Jesus in the first century. So as students of the Bible, one of the reasons that I'm particularly interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls is they help fill in our picture of what the scene was like, the world was like, the culture was like during the life of Jesus, during the time of the Gospels. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls become an important source on the first century. To understand how important, you need to understand once again kind of what were those primary sources prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's many of them, but I like to think of three as the kind of core. Number one, if you've done any of the videos with me or gone through lectures, I'm often quoting from Josephus. Josephus was a first century Jew who, during the Great Revolt that led to the destruction in 70 AD, he basically defected over to Rome and became a writer of the Jewish history of the wars throughout, particularly with Rome. And he's an interesting figure because he obviously, in many ways, what he was trying to do, it seems, is he's trying to make a credible case to Rome as his audience for why the Jewish faith is important and why it should be protected, or at least valued by Roman culture. He's also a complicated figure because his primary audience is Romans, and he ends up doing most of his work for Rome. And so, how much is he sort of biasing his history? How much of it is sort of meant to be a particular angle for political reasons? But he certainly gives us one of the best windows into what Judaism and the world of the first century was like. He's just invaluable as a historian. The second of these first century images comes from Philo. Eventually I'm going to do a video and we'll just get into all of these kind of first century sources. But Philo is what is known as a Hellenized Jew, primarily writing in Greek, and he's living in Alexandria, Egypt. So he represents, rather than Josephus, who has really grown up and sort of knows the world of Jerusalem and Judea and Galilee, Philo is representing the Jews in the diaspora, these Jews who are living in really prominent places, a major Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt. But Philo is primarily concerned with trying to make sense from a Hellenistic Greek philosophical perspective of the Old Testament teachings. So he's really trying to integrate some of the Greek thinking and philosophy with the teachings of Judaism. And he gives us, again, many details and pictures into the first century Jewish world, but he has a particular kind of Hellenistic philosophical approach to it. One of the other major sources we have for the first century world are the rabbinic traditions and writings. So the rabbis, although they do not write down much of this history in the first century, by 200 and 300 AD, they begin to produce written documents, and these primarily beginning with the Mishnah. While written later, they attest to the teachings, the discussions, and the history of the rabbis from the first century time of Jesus. So we get a window back into that from the oral tradition that eventually gets written down. And then, of course, that Mishnah will continue with the Tosefta, the additions to it, and then the Talmud, both a Jerusalem version and a Babylonian version. But again, the challenge with the rabbinic traditions is you're getting one particular line on Jewish history, and that is probably after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the rabbis continue the tradition of the Pharisees, or at least you get from this rabbinic school a particular take on the history, on the consequences of what went wrong. And so so when you read the rabbinic writings, you always read them knowing they represent a particular angle or particular view on Judaism, although they're extremely helpful to understand what's happening in the first century world. So those prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, these were the primary sources for understanding what was taking place in the first century world of Jerusalem. Now, that brings us to some objections and why I lay out all of this for trying to set up why the Dead Sea Scrolls are going to be significant. You will often hear certain objections to people trusting the Bible. So a couple of those. Number one, many feel like we can't have confidence that our biblical texts, when you pick up and start reading the Bible, that they represent the original documents. The work of generations of scribes have introduced errors and perhaps changes. So when you sit down to read your Bible, people will object, you're reading what has been produced over thousands of years. It could be completely different. How do you know that what you're reading is the actual thing that was written down? You can't have any confidence in the Bible whatsoever that it's not just been added to and made up stories. Again, and all of this is based on the fact that we only know what the Old Testament said prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls from the time period of 1000 AD. So there's this huge gap, they're saying, where who knows, what could have been added, changed by these scribes. Second, the unique New Testament ideas are from much later in church history and written back into the first century. You'll often hear this when it comes to the Gospels, that the Gospels represent later church history, the fact that they're worshiping Jesus, that they're rejecting the temple, that this is all just post the destruction of the temple, 70 AD, perhaps from 200 AD, 300 AD. And these stories, when you read the Gospels, they don't represent the actual first century world. They represent some later time where they're reading this theology back into the teachings of Jesus, who was basically a kind of moral miracle worker from the first century. So both of these critiques, they not only undermine the faithfulness of the scriptures, but they do so based on the idea that we can't trust the way the Bible has come down to us. Both of these criticisms say, we don't know enough about what was actually written to be able to trust what we now have, because this long period of time, all of these scribes that have handed it down to us, who knows what the originals looked like and all of the changes that they may have introduced. That question and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is what's going to give them so much meaning. But before we get into meaning, I want to give you a little bit of the story of how the scrolls were discovered, because as important as the Dead Sea Scrolls are, just from a student of history, the story of how they were found is, to me, almost as fascinating as their meaning. It's just this remarkable story that connects both the ancient world to our modern history in some pretty profound ways. So I want to tell you a little bit about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The first of the scrolls were discovered, what has been labeled as Cave 1, by a group of Bedouins who were traveling through the area. If you've been to Israel and you visited this site, or if you look at photos, it's what is often known as the Judean wilderness. This is not a populous area. It's right on the Dead Sea, so it's an easy place to get to as a tourist. But in the ancient world, this was not a populous place. And even in the 1940s, 1947, when these scrolls were discovered, this was, again, still not a place where people were living. And so you have these Bedouins who are basically shepherds in the 1940s who are moving back and forth, moving flocks, that they're passing through this area. There's some prominent springs nearby they were probably stopped at. And the Bedouins knew that there were ancient artifacts scattered around the land. There was a whole market for antiquities, even in the 1940s and much earlier. So these Bedouins were always on the lookout for things that they could sell to an antiquities dealer and perhaps make some money. And there's a couple of variations of the story. One of the variations says, the most common one you've probably heard, is that one of their sheep went missing, and one of these young Bedouin boys went looking for him and was throwing rocks into a cave they saw, hoping to scare this sheep out that had gone missing. If you read some of the primary sources, even the interviews with those Bedouins, it's probably just as likely that he was throwing rocks inside of these caves to see if there might be treasure or something of value inside, that he was sort of convinced he was one day going to find treasure in one of these caves being littered all over that region of the Judean wilderness. Well, this particular Bedouin boy, as he's throwing a rock into one of these caves, he hears the shatter of pottery when the rock lands inside. And this is not just a rock hitting another rock. The photo here makes it a little difficult to see because there's two lower openings that were opened up. But originally, the cave opening was much higher. In fact, it was evening time whenever he heard the rock hit and break. It was too dark for him to get inside, and so he waited until they camped nearby, and early in the next morning went and climbed and lifted himself inside. When he made it inside the cave, he found several large clay jars. Some of them had been broken, some of them were already open, and inside the scrolls had turned to dust, had deteriorated. But he did find jars that were intact and sealed. And when he opened them up, what he found were, and you can see them in the photo here, are these tightly coiled leather scrolls, which at the time he was not quite sure what these were. They were covered in a kind of sticky tar. Apparently there was a strong odor. So he and his friends retrieved the jars, retrieved these leather scrolls. For a long time, apparently they traveled with them just in a bag and would unroll them and couldn't make out what the writing was. I mean, it's a miracle they survived, because these are not, scientists who are protecting these scrolls. But eventually they made their way to Bethlehem. And in Bethlehem, they found an antiquities dealer. They originally thought perhaps they could just sell them to a cobbler because they were made of leather. Cobblers working in leather shoes, they weren't sure of their value. But they ended up meeting with an antiquity dealer who, again, did not recognize what they were. There was some concerns they might have been stolen scrolls from a Jewish synagogue. The writing, because it looked, again, like a more ancient version of Hebrew than most were familiar with, they weren't quite sure even what the writing was. But this antiquity dealer bought them for a very small sum of money, and at least knew people that he could pass them to try to gain more information of what they might be. The scrolls eventually end up in two groups, the scrolls from Cave 1, which we'll talk about what specifically they are in a moment. But they end up being broken into two different groups, and they end up in the hands of two different individuals. Again, both pretty dramatic stories I want to tell you about. The first of those groups of scrolls we're going to talk about end up in the hands of Eliezer Sukenik. Eliezer Sukenik was a Jewish archaeologist. He is in many ways the kind of father of Jewish archaeology in the nation of Israel. He had been attempting to build a museum of archaeology. He was a professor of archaeology, but he finds himself at a pretty dramatic moment to be taking up that work. Eliezer Sukenik is doing this work while Israel is in the build-up to what will become its war for independence. At the time, Israel, the land of Israel, was under the control of the British, and the Jews there were increasingly hostile for their independence. They were attacking not only the British, but there was a constant conflict between the Arab population, and it becomes so sort of radical. The British trying to, at many points, they actually would section off the neighborhoods. You can see in this photo barbed wire fencing that was put up that'll become important in a moment. They literally are trying to keep the peace, but it's becoming untenable. And so the British passed the decision over to the United Nations, who in November of 29th of 1947 will end up taking a prominent vote to declare a two-state solution, which will eventually, they try to split the land between the Jews and the Arabs, but it will lead to a war for independence where the Jews will end up fighting against not only the local Arab population, but also the surrounding Arab nations. Well, Eliezer Sukenik is contacted by an antiquities dealer, one of his friends, who tells him about these scrolls. And because his friend, his antiquity dealer, is Arab and he is a Jew, when he tries to meet to see these scrolls for the first time, they actually meet on opposite sides of one of these barbed wire fences within Jerusalem. And his friend unrolls one of these scrolls and shows it to him. And Eliezer Sukenik had one of the areas of specialty he had was in ancient Jewish tombs. So he recognized almost immediately that the Hebrew on these scrolls matched the kind of Hebrew that was common from the first century on those tombs. And so very quickly, although he was not able to read them and see them, very quickly he was convinced that these were very ancient, far more ancient than what, again, we currently had writings, perhaps from the Bible, perhaps from other writings of the time as well. So you could imagine this is a major discovery. But there's a problem. He goes home and he decides to acquire the scrolls on behalf of the university. But as I mentioned, this date is so critical. The day that he attempts to go to Bethlehem to work out a deal to acquire the scrolls is the day that the UN is planning to vote to declare this new two-state solution. And he knows that once that vote is through, it will create an uprising amongst the Arab population. Bethlehem, where he's attempting to go, is one of these prominent Arab cities where there are not Jews. So his family, of course, he is recognizing, I mean, here's this moment to acquire what is probably the greatest archaeological discovery of his life, but it falls on the very day when he knows this war is about to begin. It just so happens that there was a filibuster in the UN. They didn't have the votes to secure what the United States was trying to lead. So there was a filibuster to work on negotiating more deals with other countries before the vote took place. So it gave Eliezer Sukenik this window in which to sneak himself into the Arab-controlled Bethlehem, negotiate the purchase of these scrolls, and make his way home back through these checkpoints. And there's this great scene in his writings where he says that night, as the UN began its vote, he was sitting as his family's listening to the roll call of the vote when Israel will become a nation, and he is translating these scrolls that he's just acquired. And the particular date on this is interesting. We're going to talk about these scrolls go missing probably in around 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, with the fall of Jewish independence under the Roman conquest. And so it is you have these scrolls that both go missing at the moment of Israel no longer being sovereign, and they are rediscovered by Eliezer Sukenik the very night in which the UN now votes to make is what will eventually make Israel a nation again. So you have this just kind of amazing alignment of events that play out, a really dramatic part of the story. The second set of scrolls ended up in the hands of another individual named Athanasius Yeshua Samuel. He was a Christian who was leading a community there, a Syrian community within Jerusalem. And the scrolls, he had been interested in ancient scrolls, and so another antiquities dealer brought them to him, although he did not read Hebrew, was not a scholar of ancient scrolls. And so he was convinced they were old, although he didn't know why or have the evidence to prove it. And many people were telling him these are probably stolen from a synagogue, they're probably medieval Jewish texts, but he was convinced they were older. So he managed, at the midst of this conflict breaking out, once again, to get these to an American research facility. John Trevor, who we'll talk about, was a scholar who was in residence there. And he gets this sort of strange request from this local religious leader who has these old manuscripts. And very quickly, as he sits down and begins to translate them, he recognizes that what he's translating is from Isaiah. And he recognizes that this is an older version of Isaiah, he believes from the first century, much older than anything else they had. From there, the story gets complicated. He was able to photograph the scrolls. Athanasius was willing to let them be photographed, but Athanasius Yeshua Samuel wanted to sell the scrolls for a significant amount of money, and that was becoming more and more complicated, again, because this war is breaking out within Jerusalem, within the land. And so Athanasius actually smuggles the scrolls and himself out, going north to Syria, and eventually making his way to the United States, where he begins attempting to sell these scrolls to various organizations. But because the word has not come out about the Dead Sea Scrolls, people aren't quite convinced, and certainly not willing to pay the kind of money yet that he's talking about. And so half of the scrolls end up with Eliezer Sukenik within Jewish hands, and the other half of the scrolls ironically make their way to the United States and are unable. They remain in Athanasius' hands because he's unable to sell them. That brings us to a third character we need to introduce. This is Yigael Yadin. He takes a Hebrew name. His original name was Yigael Sukenik. So this is one of the sons of Eliezer Sukenik, who first discovered the scrolls, the Jewish archaeologist. Yigael Yadin's a fascinating character. He was studying to be an archaeologist like his father, but as war was breaking out, he left archaeology and became an officer within the Israeli army. He becomes a major figure with some pretty dramatic stories. Because of his archaeological background, there's stories about him outmaneuvering some of the Arab armies because he used the ancient roads that he knew about from his study of archaeology that they didn't, to be able to move more quickly and outmaneuver them in the wilderness. And so he's a fascinating character. There's some great interviews online to watch too, where he talks about his love for archaeology, but also his work in the military. He made his archaeological focus ancient war. So it's just fascinating the way these come together. But after the war, he goes back into archaeology. And several years after the sort of war had ended, he is in the United States on a series of lectures. And it just so happens that while he's in the U.S. lecturing on ancient Jewish culture and war, he encounters this ad in one of the newspapers. So this is June of 1954. So we're talking about several years after the original scrolls were discovered. And he reads, "The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dated back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational, religious institution by an individual or group." Yigael Yadin realizes these are the missing second half of scrolls, his father having acquired the first half. And so he gets a group together. He realizes that there's probably little chance he'll be able to acquire them as a Jew. It's a complicated relationship between Athanasius and the Jews at this time, having had to flee Israel. And so they use a third party, a Mr. Green, an intermediary, who goes in and acquires these scrolls. And they end up being taken back to Israel. So you now end up with all of the Cave 1 scrolls, the original Dead Sea Scrolls, back in Jerusalem, back in the hands of the Jewish archaeologists. Now, word had gotten out that these scrolls had been discovered in caves. And so once there was peace, you have all sorts of Bedouins and archaeologists and anybody who can find them searching for more of these caves. And they begin to uncover over the next few decades more and more of these caves, more and more of these scrolls as well. And all of those then eventually, through, again, more complicated history, they will eventually end up in the hands of both American as well as Jordanian as well as Israeli archaeologists who will begin the process of piecing together just unbelievable amounts of fragments. Some of the scrolls intact, as we'll see, but lots and lots of them just in these tiny fragmentary pieces. But they will work over decades to piece together all of these fragments and begin these readings of what are known as the Library of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Today, if you're interested, there is a whole museum in Jerusalem known as the Shrine of the Book. It's really remarkable. If you notice the outside photo here, it's designed to look like one of the tops of the jars that the scrolls were kept in. And then as you go inside, you'll notice it looks like the inside of a jar, but in this center sort of scroll, I guess you'd call it really like a statue, you have the great Isaiah scroll, one of the scrolls from Cave 1 that was found almost entirely intact. And you can walk around and see it. It's really a remarkable thing that it exists, and particularly exists in that kind of quality. So this is from the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. Let's talk a little bit about the naming of the scrolls as we get into why these scrolls matter. It's really important to be able to understand kind of what those original scrolls were, as well as how the scrolls are referred to. So again, I have a little map here that's showing the community of Qumran, which we believe are associated with these scrolls, the various caves that are around them. There'll be even more than what's shown here on the map. But the way the scrolls get described is through this sort of naming convention. So you'll see I've got 3 of them here. So 1Q, what's short for Isaiah A. So you get, in this naming convention, you get the cave, the first number, the cave that it was found in. So in this case, Cave 1, Cave 11, Cave 4. The Q stands for Qumran, this community, or we'll see in a moment, archaeological site that's associated with it. And then you have the book or the fragment number. So Isaiah 1, the second one is Melchizedek, a writing about Melchizedek that's not from the scriptures. We'll talk about those in a second. And then sometimes when they're so fragmentary or there's questions, you'll just get simply, so in this bottom example, this is a scroll or a fragment from Cave 4, Qumran, and it's fragment number 14 found within Cave 4. So you get this designation. If you're ever reading about the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the common naming convention you'll see in the process. Let's talk a little bit about Cave 1 specifically, which again, I've been giving you this history of how the scrolls from Cave 1 were divided. You find these particular 7 scrolls in Cave 1. So number 1, the Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah A. A second Isaiah Scroll, which is 1Q Isaiah B. You have a unique writing called the Community Rule, 1QS, and this is basically the rules for the community around Qumran. They become really important again as one of these pictures into the 1st century. You have 1QP Habakkuk, that's the Pesher of Habakkuk. A Pesher is basically a commentary, so it's not the book of Habakkuk in this case, but a writing about Habakkuk. You have a unique sectarian writing called the War Scroll, which is a kind of apocalyptic image of a future war that's to come. 1QH is the Thanksgiving hymns. It's a collection of psalms, which are related specifically to the community of Qumran. And then you also have the Genesis Apocryphon, which is basically a retelling of the Genesis story that's separate from the actual Genesis story. So those are the 7 scrolls that are found in Cave 1. The dating of these scrolls is important because the writing of the Hebrew, again, because it was pre-Masoretic, we could tell that, their ability to both do testing of the materials, as well as there were other archaeological finds within the caves. In addition to that, the writing style, they were able to identify these scrolls as being from the 3rd to the 1st century. So 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. So you have scrolls basically from 300 BC to 100 AD when we believe the Qumran community was destroyed. So these scrolls are almost 1,000 years older than the previous manuscripts, 1,000 years. So when we talk to the beginning, we'll get to why, again, in the end here, I'll talk about the conclusions from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But imagine, you're trying to compare all of these manuscripts. The oldest ones of the Old Testament you have are from 1000 AD. And now all of a sudden you have manuscripts to compare those to that go all the way back to 300 BC. You're talking about, 1,000 to 1,300 years older than the manuscripts we had. So if you're looking at these manuscripts, not just, it's cool that they're old, but if you're looking at them as an opportunity to compare and see where changes may have happened within that scribal tradition, well, now all of a sudden you have the opportunity to look back 1,000 years earlier and compare those manuscripts to the ones we had from 1000. So what did they find when we did that? That's one of the things we're definitely going to talk about. I brought some books. Usually on my bookshelf I have these, but I want to talk a little bit about the publication. If you're interested in how you can see these, there are compilations of the Dead Sea Scrolls you can buy on Amazon in modern translation. But most of the scrolls, the actual academic release of the scrolls, are known as the Discoveries in the Judean Wilderness, and it's in several volumes. I actually brought, one of the things that I've tried to do is I've spent the last few years collecting the earliest publications. So some of this is pretty nerdy if you're into this thing. If not, skip ahead. But prior to the official release, you have a few different releases. And I've actually got a view here I can show you. So this is the Dead Sea Scrolls from Hebrew University, and it's a really interesting kind of box set that these come in. And so you have both the actual published book that shows information about their discovery, the information, pictures, as well as kind of an accounting of which caves had which. But one of the things I love about it is you get photographs of all of the fragments. So these are some of the earliest discoveries, again, from Hebrew University. Really great. I've kept them all together, but I've also thought one of these days about framing these because I think it's such a cool set. And again, this publication is from the very beginning in the 1940s, just right after the discovery. The next thing I wanted to show you was, because this represents, remember, Eleazar Sukenik, the first grouping of scrolls. The second grouping of scrolls it's referred to here as the Dead Sea Scrolls of St. Mark's Monastery. So Athanasius, this was the monastery he was leading at the time. And so you get something very similar, some of the earliest publications of his scrolls as documentation. And there's a second version of that came out of volume 2. So it has, of course, the Isaiah manuscripts, the Habakkuk commentary we talked about. And then there are the official publications from Cave 1, so the Discoveries in the Judean Wilderness. You'll notice these are like the photo I showed you here. So I've got the two publications that are from Cave 1 and Cave 11. And I'll show you those real quick just because I think they're interesting as well. So inside of here, you get a pretty extensive commentary on the scrolls, thoughts on the scrolls, the translation on the scrolls. You'll actually get those in both English and French. Sometimes you'll see the French because it was French archaeologists that were really some of the first to begin the excavations of Qumran itself and some of the additional caves. But these, if you're interested in the most primary kind of original publications, these are the documents that make those up. And again, some of them can get kind of expensive, but this has been one of my hobbies, is trying to track these down and collect these. Let's talk for a second about then the meaning of the scrolls, because I want to get into really some of the conclusions that we can make from the scrolls. And some of them are pretty profound. One of the most famous scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls is from Cave 1, ironically. They didn't just find the cave that had the scraps. They found the cave with some of the best finds. And of those scrolls, the Great Isaiah Scroll, the one that's featured in the Museum of the Book, it really is remarkable. It includes the entire book of Isaiah. The scroll itself, if you wrap it all the way out, is 24 feet long. It's written on 17 sheets of parchment. And they believe this particular scroll dates to about 125 BC. So, what a gift it is to find the entire book so that you can now compare the Isaiah that we had put together from the various manuscripts we had. Now you can just take it and compare it side by side with this Isaiah scroll from, at least 1,000 years earlier than the one we had. If you think about all of the scrolls that end up being found and all of the fragments, I think the best way to think of the Dead Sea Scrolls is really as a library of scrolls. You have in total 15,000 fragments. That makes up a library collection of 950 to 1,000 unique scrolls. We don't have all of those scrolls intact, but based on their sort of understanding comparison of the fragments, they believe this library across all of these caves was close to 1,000 unique pieces of work. So obviously you have much more than just the Bible. Some of those are obviously, they have multiple versions or multiple copies of biblical books, but there's whole other categories of literature within this library other than just the biblical books. So if you break the scrolls down, they can roughly be organized into 3 different categories. So number one, 40% of them are the books of the Bible, the Old Testament books. Scholars have found evidence for every single book of the Bible except for Esther and perhaps Nehemiah. Why do I say it that way? Nehemiah, there's some questions about if fragments are from Nehemiah or perhaps other books, although they definitely could be Nehemiah. They have not found any fragments that they link to Esther. That opens a couple of questions. Is it possible that this particular community of Jews didn't consider the book of Esther to be scripture? Esther, if you remember from your study, is a really interesting and unique book in the Old Testament that doesn't specifically mention God. It's trying to show God at work, even in ways where he's not named. But it's possible, since it didn't include that, maybe they did not include it as a part of their canon of scripture. It's also possible, as short as Esther is, and so many of these scrolls being in such poor fragmentary shape, that it was just deteriorated, that perhaps it did exist there, and the scraps of it, because of it being a short or a small book, have just not been found or completely deteriorated. The second set of books we have is what are known as just Jewish literature, about 30%. And these contain books that scholars already knew about or had later variations of, but again, now have in these older copies. So books like Enoch or Jubilees, Tobit, the Wisdom of Syriac, as well as some additional Psalms. So you have this broader Jewish literature that we knew about from the ancient world, but also seems to have been being read or studied or written down here in Qumran. And then the third are what are called sectarian scrolls. I used that word already. These are scrolls that seem to be unique to this community of scribes, this community of priests. So books like the Community Rule we talked about, the War Scroll. There's another famous one called the Temple Scroll. So these are particular writings of what scholars believe to be the Essene community who are in Qumran, who are obviously maintaining this library and adding works to it themselves. So when you hear the Dead Sea Scrolls, you think of them as a library of scrolls based on this community, and they are everything from Jewish literature to the Bible to as well the writings of that particular people. It's worth talking a little bit about Qumran specifically and who these scrolls belong to, because again, remember, one of the things I said is that the Dead Sea Scrolls were going to be important for understanding the accuracy of scribal transmission of manuscripts. But the second thing I said I think they're really helpful for is they give us a really unique image or window into the first century world. And that's certainly true when we begin to study this community that's associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Scholars began to find scrolls within these caves, but they also recognized that nearby, so from some of the caves far less than a mile, from others around a mile, these caves are all in the hills, but down on a platform below the caves, there was an old archaeological site that had not been excavated, on old ruins. And so obviously finding the scrolls, scholars were immediately interested now in these ruins, and so they began excavation of what is known as Qumran. You can visit here today. It's a really fascinating site. It's a fairly large site. You can see from this photo, you have many buildings of fairly large sizes, as well as larger gathering spaces, some open courtyard spaces, a lot of ritual baths. We learn a lot about the community just from the kinds of dwellings and buildings. But again, this is a group who is living out in this wilderness area. They do find space inside where they were working on scrolls, creating scrolls, probably writing scrolls. And so these scrolls end up, for reasons of speculation, perhaps because of an approaching army, the Romans coming, perhaps these caves get moved, or these scrolls get moved to the caves for protection. Perhaps they are always kept there as well. But these scrolls end up in the caves around this community of Qumran, although the two are associated. We know a little bit about this community, probably from writings like Pliny the Elder, who's a Roman author who's been traveling through in the first century, documenting, his travels and his sites. And he writes about what sounds to be this community at Qumran. So we get statements like this. On its west side, he's referring to the Dead Sea. So you can see on the map here, Qumran sets up here in the north. On the west side, so you have Jerusalem in the hills. If you come down to Jericho and then down to the Dead Sea, you have Qumran. So on the west side of the Dead Sea, just far enough from the shore to avoid its baneful influences, lived the Essenes. They form a solitary community, and they inspire our admiration more than any other community in the whole world. They live without women, for they have recounted all sexual life. They live without money and without any company save that of the palm trees. Below their headquarters was the town of En-Gedi, so you see that on the map further south, whose fertility and palm groves formerly made it second only to Jerusalem. So we don't, obviously he does not mention Qumran, but based on what he's describing here, so up from the Dead Sea on the west side, it's above En-Gedi. Based on the archaeology of the area, the most obvious thing that's being described, particularly because of his reference to Essenes, is this community of Qumran. There are some questions. There is a burial ground near Qumran that does have women in it, although it is predominantly men. So there's some debate about what's being described here. But most likely what we have is this dwelling of Qumran, this community of Qumran in the wilderness, is a group of Essenes who we've talked about. I did a whole video, if you remember, on the various Jewish sects in the first century. I talk a lot about the Essenes there and what they believed. But Qumran is probably a community of the Essenes, and they are the ones who are caring for, maintaining, and writing these scrolls that are being found in the caves around. We know from other ancient sources that the Essenes lived in every other town. So Josephus says the Essenes had settled not in one city, but in large numbers in every town, that there's a broader movement of the Essenes. So what is the particular area of Qumran? There are different theories. One theory is that Qumran may have been a kind of retreat center. Some of the large gathering places meant that there was more space than what seems to have been the number of people living there. So perhaps this was a place where for certain festivals or events, these Essenes from other places would come together. It's also possible that it's just the dwelling of this unique group of priests and scribes who are maintaining this work. So there's lots of ongoing debate about how to think about what Qumran is, but it certainly seems to be associated with this group of Essenes. We need to talk a little bit about its destruction, because we don't have a precise evidence of when it was destroyed, but we have other pieces of information that help us better understand what might have been going on. So there are a few sources. Number one, there's the actual archaeology. There is a destruction layer at Qumran. So we know that at some point walls were toppled. There's a burn layer in places, as well as, and I brought something else to show you, they have found Roman arrowheads. I actually have one of these, not perhaps from Qumran, but from the same time period. So you see this Roman arrowhead. They found a large collection of these arrowheads around the site at Qumran. So this was not probably, obviously if you have Roman arrowheads, this is not just sort of like leftovers from the Qumran community. It represents what was probably a Roman attack. That with the burn layer and the destruction, it's pretty confident that it was destroyed by the Romans during the Roman conquest around 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed. I have on the map here a few other details. We know from the ancient sources the areas around Qumran that were destroyed. So, of course, Jerusalem, Herodium, which was one of Herod's kind of major fortresses, Jericho. There's mention of the Roman armies coming down to the Dead Sea from Jericho. We know from the ancient sources they burned Machaerus, which is on the east side, as well as En-Gedi. And if you know that kind of period of history, the last stand of the Jews who ended up committing suicide was in Masada, all the way down here towards the bottom of the Dead Sea. So, I mean, it makes basic sense. If the Jewish armies come from Jerusalem or from the north and then take Machaerus and then back down the other side of the Dead Sea, they're going to pass right by this community of Qumran. There's no way to miss it. And if they're passing by it, they're probably not leaving a group of Jews unless they surrendered. But we have this burn layer. We have Roman arrowheads. What seems to have happened is Qumran was attacked by the Romans and destroyed. And so there are questions about the scrolls themselves. Perhaps the scrolls were put in the caves during the anticipated attack to try to preserve the texts. Some of the caves that have the most kind of fragmentary, the most fragments of scrolls, there are theories that perhaps the Romans discovered some of these caves and actually sought to destroy the texts as well, and not all of the caves were discovered. We're not exactly sure, but we do know this community ceased to exist after this period of time, and the scrolls end up in these caves around this period, not to be discovered again until 1947. Which is really remarkable. That's why they're so well preserved in this arid kind of desert climate in these caves, in these jars. They're able to survive for all these hundreds of years. So, final question, the big thing we wanted to talk about. Why then are the Dead Sea Scrolls so important? Why are they one of the most important archaeological discoveries, I think, in history, but certainly of the last century? A few things we could say about them. They are an opportunity to compare the older manuscripts. And what we see is, we do see differences between these Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts and the ones we had from 1000, but they are primarily changes in spelling, changes in place names or numbers, occasional issues that may seem to be translations or the dependence on other translations or other variations of those scrolls that have come down. What we don't find are massive rewrites, as if these older versions, take the Isaiah scroll, as if a whole new ending had been added to Isaiah, or as if whole stories had been inserted into the biblical narratives. One of the scholars puts it this way: there are relatively few examples of passages that are totally different in the Dead Sea Scrolls than they appear in the medieval Hebrew manuscripts, the ones we talked about from 1000. And the majority of the passages that are different match other known versions of the Old Testament, usually the Greek translation, the Septuagint. This means that the Old Testament has been copied and transmitted with remarkable accuracy. It's not a stretch to say the Hebrew Bible known to Jesus is essentially the same as the one known to us. All of this leads to the conclusion that the Dead Sea Scrolls sometimes complicate but generally confirm our knowledge of the Old Testament text. I think that's a great way of putting it. One of the reasons the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important is they gave us a jump back 1,000 years in the manuscripts. And what we discovered is that this tradition of the manuscripts taking the texts seriously and being obsessed with preserving the details of the text, not editing them, changing them, reworking them, but preserving the tradition of the text. That when we jumped back 1,000 years, we found that generally speaking, these were the same texts that we had in 1000, which means you have a very old tradition of Jewish scholars who have been faithful to pass down the text. It gives us an increased likelihood that the version we're reading really is accurate to what was originally written. Now, as a Christian, I believe God has been faithful to preserve that text. That's not a jump for me. But we have archaeological evidence and manuscript evidence that make it more and more likely that is true, that take some of the attacks like, how can we trust what the Bible says? Don't you know the scribes have been editing and changing and rewriting and adding? Well, since at least 300 BC, we find that generally not to be true. They've been obsessed with preserving the text in their accuracy. Another important takeaway from the Dead Sea Scrolls: they're a fascinating glimpse into the complexity of Jewish faith in the first centuries. This is a really important point that I've made before, but I want you to hear. There was not one uniform Judaism in the first century. What we find instead from Josephus, from Philo, from the rabbinic traditions, and now this Testament, some of those sectarian writings from the Essene community, is that you had very different types of Jewish faith and practice taking place in the first century. And as Jesus is interacting, some of the things that Jesus said, some of the things that scholars would look at in the Gospels that felt different than the depiction of Judaism from perhaps the rabbinic tradition, had led scholars to believe that perhaps later 200-300 years after Christ, the church was writing those things back in. So we'll talk about one in a moment, but just to give you an example, the rejection of the temple, right? So it's hard to believe when Jesus is talking about the temple being destroyed, that could be true as early as the time of Jesus and the Gospels in the first century. So many scholars said, well, obviously later Christians knew the temple would be destroyed, so they're writing this back in, they're putting these words in Jesus' mouth. What we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was there were other Jews of the time who were already rejecting and speaking of a coming judgment on the temple. So by seeing it, we recognized, oh, Jesus is actually a part of a first century world that had more voices and perspectives than perhaps we realized. And getting that picture helps us have more confidence. Jesus is engaging the actual conversations taking place in his day, and we can see that in the literature from the time period. So it's it's interesting for our study of the Bible. It's interesting just as a person interested in history, but it also gives us more confidence in that what the Gospels are describing really does sound like something from the other writings of this time period as well. Number 3. The Dead Sea Scrolls help us better understand Jesus and the first Christians and their theology. I think it's important to say that Jesus does not seem to be an Essene. He was not a part of this community. But many of his ideas, as I just said, they actually resonate with broader ideas taking place in the first century, and they give a historical context to Jesus and his teachings that gives us a higher degree of confidence that what we read in the Gospels really are the ideas of Jesus from the time period of the first century. Let me give you a few examples of that because I think it's helpful. helpful. One of the first ones is from John the Baptist. So what do we know about John the Baptist from the Gospels? He's in the wilderness preparing, well, this is from Isaiah, right? In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the deserts a highway for God. That John the Baptist is modeling himself on this Old Testament image. So what we associate with John the Baptist was the Judean wilderness, was an emphasis on water baptism, was a messianic expectation. You have a person who is rejecting the full sort of establishment of Jerusalem and its temple, and instead he's going out into the wilderness, calling people to the wilderness to repent, to be baptized in water, and to expect the coming of the Messiah. That sounds like a radical idea, but we actually find that's a lot of what Qumran, the Essenes, were doing as well too, rejecting the temple, moving out into the wilderness. I already mentioned there were a lot of baptisms as far as mikvah, the kind of purity baptisms taking place in Qumran. This is going to be different than what John is doing, but again, it gives us a sense that what John is doing is not so far removed from these other broader movements or ideas of the time. So we read this in 1QS, the scroll from Qumran, the community roll, one of those sectarian passages. By the Holy Spirit of the community and his truth shall we be cleansed of all his sins, and by the spirit of uprightness and humility shall his iniquity be atoned. By his soul's humility towards all the precepts of God shall his flesh be cleansed when sprinkled with lustrous waters and sanctified in flowing water, and he shall establish his steps to walk perfectly in all of the ways of God according to his commands. I mean, this sounds a lot like the kind of language and the work that John the Baptist is doing. John is distinct. I've talked about that in some of our Luke lectures, but hopefully you see here again, what's being described in the Gospels sounds like the world of the first century, not a later time period. The second I already mentioned was the rejection of the temple. The Qumran community believed that the community itself was an alternative temple. And that's a really interesting idea because what they believed was it was the community of the Essenes, the people, in their relationship with each other that was the replacement of the physical temple in Jerusalem. They saw the Jerusalem temple as corrupt, so their community became a new temple. A temple is a kind of community of believers. Now, that sounds like a later idea, but seeing it place in Qumran helps us better understand how Jesus and his followers also have a similar idea to this. So in Qumran, we read in one of the K4 passages, the fragments, he has commanded that a mikdash Adam, a temple of men, be built for himself, that they might send up like the smoke of incense the works of the law. So a temple of men sounds a lot like what the New Testament will see as the church being the new temple of God's presence. So once again, Jesus's teachings are not later church teachings being read back into the first century. What Jesus is doing and saying about the temple sounds very much like other Jews at the time rejecting the temple. Another one of the sacred meals. So of course, we have the Christian tradition of communion, the Eucharist, which was another area where some scholars thought, boy, this seems like something much later that they're trying to establish a tradition for. And so you sort of put these words in Jesus' mouth, which doesn't seem to be, a common practice amongst the rabbinic writings. So it makes what Jesus was doing sound perhaps later. But when we study broader history from the time period and what was discovered within Qumran, we recognize once again that the way Jesus was practicing some of these community meals and establishing communion has connections to ideas from the first century, not later church history. So from 1QS, the community rule, which was basically the rules for how you lived at Qumran as a scene, we read this. When they gather for the common table, or to drink the new wine, and the common table is prepared, and the new wine mixed for drinking, let no man stretch out his hand over the first fruit of bread and new wine before the priest. For it is he who shall bless the first fruits of bread and new wine, and shall first stretch out his hand over the bread, and afterwards the Messiah of Israel shall stretch out his hands over the bread, and afterwards the whole congregation of the community shall be blessed in the order appropriate to his honor. It is in accordance with the statute that they shall proceed at every meal at which at least 10 men gather. So this is instructions for how a meal is to be shared. But catch, again, some of the interesting elements. It speaks of bread and wine, right? So this is distinct from perhaps the tradition of the Passover meal. So you have this bread and wine meal. There is a prayer that's shared as a part of it. This sounds very much like what Jesus did. It's being administered by one, this priest. It's being an anticipation of the Messiah to come and do the same. And it's leading as a kind of worship, a sacred meal that's being shared together. I mean, that sounds, in many ways, it's not the exact formula Jesus is using, but this idea of a meal shared in anticipation of the Messiah is not something, again, later Christians have written back onto Jesus, but a kind of idea that was common to Judaism at the time. So it gives us a really good picture of Jesus sounding and acting like the people of the first century world. Although Jesus will have his unique message and take on these things, he very much feels like the first century world. And because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a fuller image of what Judaism, or the various kinds of Judaism, were like in the first century. A lot we've worked through there. I do want to give you a few more book recommendations, but just to summarize, the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a better image of the world and the scriptures from the first century before and the time of Jesus. So they are both a tool for our confidence in scripture and the work of the scribes, and they're also a tool for helping us better understand the world of Jesus in the first century. If you stick around for some of the lectures that I have coming up, or if you're doing the Luke series that I've been doing as well, I will mention Qumran, I'll mention the Dead Sea Scrolls. When we talked about John the Baptist, I alluded to some of these writings because they really do give us a better picture. Now, if you're interested in going deeper, because I've really condensed a lot of material, I brought another stack of books here that I thought might be helpful. So let me give you a few other recommendations. And I always like primary sources. So one of the great books is The Message of the Scroll by Yigael Yadin. So this book is actually written by Yigael Yadin and talks a lot about his father's discovery, Eliezer Sukenik, and some of Yigael Yadin's work. He did a lot of work on the War Scroll, which was his background. So a really interesting read as a primary source. The second is actually one written by Athanasius Yeshua Samuel. You'll find that there are differences of opinion in the history, or the way that the events of the history are understood. And so this is definitely one. I would not say this is the most historically accurate, but it's his take and what he believes to be the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have Sukenik, his kind of testimony through his son Yigael Yadin, and the other set of scrolls through Yeshua. And then two books I mentioned that one of the people that Yeshua Samuel worked with was John Trevor, who was an American scholar at the time there in Jerusalem. But if you're interested in Trevor's take, he has a great book called The Untold Story of Qumran. So you can see it's by his name. And he really digs, even after the events, he goes back and does a lot of research. So there's a great picture of him here with Yeshua. He does some great research talking about the history of the scrolls. He interviews some of the Bedouins that were associated. This is just a great book, has a lot of great images. I'm sure you can find it on eBay or perhaps on eBay. And then the last book, if you're interested in Qumran and the archaeology itself, one of my favorite scholars is Jody Magnus, and she has this book on the archaeology of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is going to give you a lot of the history of the actual community of the Essenes, what we learn about them from their own writings. So if you're interested in that picture of the people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is one of my favorite books. She has a great course on Audible as well, too, that she talks a lot about the Essenes and the Qumran community. So any of her work, I highly recommend. Well, I've condensed a lot. I've loved the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've got a lot more books. I'm super interested if you have comments or questions to dig into it in a little more detail. It's something that will come up in our other videos. But I hope that's an introduction to the story, the history, and ultimately the significance, the meaning behind the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls.